What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what we might broadly call the Japanese diaspora, although in my own work I'm not entirely comfortable with that concept because it seems to imply that there's a kind of essential Japaneseness that travels around the world and remains in a kind of permanent way. And this is particularly noticeable, or this question is particularly resonant in Brazil, because on the one hand, you have an enormous population, a Brazilian population of Japanese descent. There are more people of Japanese descent in Brazil than all the rest of the world put together, excluding Japan, obviously. So in other words, if you imagine that little Tokyo in Los Angeles has a lot of Japanese people, in Brazil that's called like a small neighborhood of people of Japanese descent. Yet, and Japanese Brazilians in general have an extremely clear Brazilian identity. They don't think of themselves as Japanese. They think of themselves as Japanese Brazilians. And one aspect of their thinking about themselves as Japanese Brazilians is often hating Japan. And one of the reasons this comes up is because in Brazil, Japanese Brazilians, as we're going to see when I get into the formal part in a second, are called Japanese. So in other words, when you're in the public sphere in Brazil and somebody says, there's a Japanese person, you have no idea if they mean a business person who's just come over from Japan for some work, or a Brazilian person whose great-grandparents migrated from Japan, or at this point, great-great-grandparents migrated from Japan, right? So there's a kind of very interesting popular sense that there's this category that's called Japanese that includes everybody, whereas at the same time, the Brazilians of Japanese descent themselves are actually kind of struggling against that all the time. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about today is the images on these issues and how people of Japanese descent do that. So let's see. Our Japanese are more creative than everybody else's Japanese. This slogan, our Japanese are more creative than everyone else's Japanese, is used by the Brazilian consumer electronics firm Toshiba. And it's one of the very best known slogans in Brazilian advertising. Created by the talent advertising agency in 1992, it emerged out of other advertisements that were very, very widely spread in Brazil in the 1970s and 1980s that said things like, we need more Brazilians like this Japanese. These slogans and the ideas embedded in them resonate so deeply that I have yet to meet somebody from the city of São Paulo, which, as I said, is home to the largest population of Japanese descent in the world, of any class background, who can't finish the sentence when I start with something like, our Japanese are, everybody instantly knows to say, better than everybody else's Japanese, right? So I want to mention this because this is a very strongly held idea. It's one that's widely dispersed. A web search reinforces the point. Our Japanese are better, more creative, stronger, smarter than everybody else's Japanese is used for everything from nicknames of Japanese Brazilian bloggers to advertisements, legal and illegal. The widespread familiarity with this idea that our Japanese are better than everybody else's Japanese does not mean that there's actual agreement on what this slogan means. Indeed, one of the strengths of these kind of advertising slogans, one of the reasons that it's been used from the 1970s until this day, is that they play with ideas of race, nation, and ethnicity. If our Japanese are Brazilians, then who's everybody else's Japanese? What are the implications of that the denomination Japanese has when it both means that somebody is Brazilian and somebody is completely not Brazilian. And in this slogan, who are everybody else's Japanese? Are they Japanese from Japan? Are they people of Japanese descent from other countries? In fact, when I was teaching at the University of São Paulo, I showed this. I taught a very, very large class with hundreds and hundreds of students. And one day I showed them this, and we kind of had a discussion. Who were our Japanese and who were everybody else's Japanese? So all of the students in the class agreed that our Japanese is a way of saying Brazilian. They all understood this advertisement and ones like that as nationalist advertisements, as playing on Brazilian nationalism. But there was a kind of dispute between who everybody else's Japanese were. Some of the students said everyone else's Japanese meant people from Japan, and that the advertisement was trying to suggest, or advertisements like this were trying to suggest, that while Japanese products were technologically sophisticated, Japanese Brazilian products combined technological sophistication with a kind of, I'm not even sure how to say it, but I can make the movement, right? With a kind of Brazilian flair, right? So in other words, their argument was that when you say Japanese and you mean people from Japan, it means these very uptight, overly hardworking, not very interesting, technologically aggressive, but that Japanese Brazilians were like Brazilians with the added value of Japaneseness. Now, some of the other students in the class took an entirely different approach. They argued that everyone else's Japanese meant Japanese people of Japanese descent from other places in Latin America, and particularly from Paraguay. And so what they understood this advertisement to mean was that Japanese Brazilians were Brazilians who were part of a large, sophisticated industrial country, unlike Japanese Paraguayans who were from this little country best known in Brazil for making fake products, right? So in other words, that this was about kind of the idea that Brazilian products are legitimate and Paraguayan products are illegitimate. But of course, it's fascinating because neither the words Brazil nor Paraguay are involved in this advertisement, right? So you see here this kind of incredible idea of embedding in this word Japan lots and lots of national meanings. The other thing that I want to point out, and this is particularly, I think, for audiences in the United States, is it's hard to imagine a company in the United States using an advertisement like this. In other words, if I don't know, Ford came up with something like, you know, our Germans are better than everybody else's Germans because they have some fancy car that they want to make Germanish or something like that, there would be outrage, right? There would be protests, there would be marches. But in the Brazilian setting, most people don't see this as being particularly racially charged. In other words, it's so comfortable, the idea that you would talk about Brazilians with these other kinds of words, that they were very cool with it. Now, this advertisement and the other ones like this are just the most recent chapter in a long history in which ethnicity or ideas about ethnicity are used as an artifact to interpret Brazilianness. Today I'm going to focus on Nikkei, and I'm going to use this word Nikkei, which is the term used by many Japanese Brazilians to describe Japanese Brazilians, right? So I'm going to use this rather than the more common Brazilian term Japanese so that we're clear who I'm talking about at least, okay? So I'm going to talk about Nikkei and images of them by the broad Brazilian majority today. I've chosen this group, or I'm interested in this group, because many Brazilians reject in Nikkei what many scholars see as a dominant feature of Brazilian culture, which is ethnic mutability. So the population broadly looks at Japanese Brazilians and kind of says, They are a closed community who has these very essential kinds of characteristics, unlike Brazilians, who they would claim are all mixed up, right? They have all sorts of different characteristics in them. Nikkei, I would argue, more than any of the other many ethnic groups in Brazil, and here I'm thinking about people of Middle Eastern descent, Jews of both Middle Eastern and European descent, Polish Catholics. I'm trying to think of very big immigrant groups in Brazil. But Nikkei, more than any of these other groups, are essentialized. In many ways, replicating an intellectual and popular tradition in Japan that proposes Japanese are so unique that they are even physically unlike other humans, right? I'm sure the scholars of Japan have heard that part of it as well. So here we have this interesting idea that in Japan, there's an idea of Japanese being special, right? And this gets replicated in Brazil, except that the people who are the targets of this replication aren't very enthusiastic about that, okay? And that's really the question here. So in Brazil, we have an interesting twist on the ways we think about ethnicity. Nikkei are believed to be ethnically rigid and part of an impenetrable community, and thus not quite fully Brazilian, while at the same time, as we see clearly in this advertisement, many Brazilians believe that Brazil will improve if the population becomes more Japanese. Okay, so this is a very interesting kind of idea about how national identity works. We might think of this a little bit in a comparison with the United States. In the United States, my sense is that the way national identity works vis-a-vis immigrants and ethnicities is that the United States, in this kind of abstract national sense, is this culturally powerful and wonderful country. And when immigrants come, they get the kind of privilege of becoming American, right? America, the country, gives immigrants this gift of Americanness. And whenever there's a feeling in the United States that this gift of Americanness is being abused or challenged, and this seems to happen all the time, we have things like nativist movements, anti-immigration bills. I don't know how it works in Michigan, but I live in Georgia, right? And in Georgia, I mean, the cops can stop you because you don't look American enough, right? So that's like kind of all allowed, right? So that's a kind of an idea that the culture of the United States is special and immigrants are somehow challenging it. In Brazil, I think it works in a slightly different way. I think the sense, especially among Brazilian elites, is that the problem of Brazil is that it's filled with Brazilians. And by that, what they really mean is a heritage of slavery. They're talking about non-whiteness. It's a very racist kind of idea, right? The problem of the country is that it's filled with residents of the country. So immigrants play an entirely different role in Brazil. So immigrants don't come to Brazil to be improved by Brazil. Rather, they come to Brazil to improve Brazil. Does that make sense? Right? So in other words, nativist movements, very, very rare in Brazil. Right? There's only been a couple of moments when they've happened. Anti-immigration, it works entirely in a different way in Brazil. In Brazil, every 5 years for about the last 30 years, government says, all illegal immigrants now are legal. End of discussion. Go to the cops, get your paper, done. Okay? So imagine that in the United States context, right? I mean, so why would you do that, right? You would do that because you think that the country is going to be improved by having all these people, right? And so that's where you get this very interesting kind of give and take between our Japanese are better than everybody else's Japanese, right? We, Japanese, whatever that word means, make Brazil better, while at the same time, there's this idea that they're not fully Brazilian, right? And so it's kind of operating at the same time. So what differentiates Japanese Brazilians from other ethnic groups who I mentioned is the heavy presence of Japan and Japaneseness in all aspects of Brazilian culture. In advertising, in products, in retail and commercial relationships, in food. So for example, like sushi is a very common Brazilian food now. Like when you go to a kind of classic Brazilian restaurants, I don't know if any of you know what rodizio is, a churrascaria. These are places where you go and eat these enormous spits of meat, right? That it's considered very Brazilian. But on the buffet table, there's always sushi now, right? So and that's not just in São Paulo. I mean, I've had this in very offbeat places where there are no people of Japanese descent. It becomes a kind of Japanese product. In fact, this is a really funny story. This is a different. So there's a new Chinese migration to Brazil. This has happened like in the last, 15 years or so. And so one of the things that Chinese migrants would do, or do when they come to Brazil, is sell street food. And one of the things that they started selling on the street was yakisoba. I'm sorry, lo mein, right? Kind of something in a wok. And they discovered that nobody knew what lo mein was. And so they reconfigured the lo mein as yakisoba. And they claim if you ask them where they're from, they say, oh, we're from Japan, okay? So there's an entire phenomena kind of what we might call, I don't know what you'd call it, kind of nation switching, right? Because everybody understands what yakisoba is, right? That's something that's easy to understand. And so if you become Japanese, you can deal with those things. One of the things, however, that makes Japaneseness so present, well, there are a number of things that make Japaneseness so present. First is the numbers. As I said to you, there are more Japanese Brazilians than any place else. Second is physicality. Unlike, for example, Arab Brazilians or Jewish Brazilians or Polish Brazilians, who, if they want, can just change their names and just claim to be a kind of normative Brazilian, it's very, very hard for Japanese Brazilians to do this, right? There's an idea that they look somehow different than the norm. Furthermore, the presence of Japan, the country, is much stronger than the presence of, for example, Poland, the country, Syria, the country, Lebanon, the country. In other words, Japan, even now in its kind of impoverished stage vis-a-vis what it was, is still a very, very important economic power. And that means something about people, the way people understand what's going on. The complex relationship between a nation that imagines itself to be ethnically flexible and the reality that some groups have flexibility than others can be seen in the newest advertisements for this company, Toshiba. The advertisements, so these are this is relatively new, and there was a TV set of advertisements, but also if you traveled by plane in Brazil for about 3 years, these were stickers that were put on the back of every seat, right? So you'd sit down and you'd look at them. I'm going to show you them. The advertisements on the surface play on this idea of Brazilian flexibility, right? In other words, the idea that anybody can turn Japanese, right? Anybody can become Japanese. And the way you become Japanese is by using really cool technology built in Brazil, right? That's what I think the idea. But another analysis shows that the images are simultaneously doing exactly the opposite. Part of the way the images work is that you laugh at them because they almost seem ridiculous, right? So on the one hand, it's kind of saying this Afro-descendente guy can become Japanese, right? If he wears the clothes, he puts on the headset, he uses the computer, right? And by Japanese, I don't mean from Japan, right? I'm using it in the Brazil sense, right? Can become a better Brazilian. But on the other hand, you have this sense that it's kind of ridiculous. It says at the top there, to pretend to be Japanese is easy, right? What's difficult is to make a computer with that kind of great technology. Now, I just want to show you a couple of others. So this is the kind of David Beckham becoming Japanese. And this is the gender bending version of it, right? In which in the television commercial, it's really funny how the television commercial works. This guy stands behind like a desk in a computer store, and the other two guys, the Afrodescendente guy and the David Beckham guy, kind of walk in, and they say, "Oh, I need a new computer." And this guy responds in a very heavy Portuguese accent. And in Brazil, Portuguese is like one of the mocked kind of minority groups, like in the way, I don't know if it's still this way in the United States, but remember there used to be Polish jokes in the United States? So in Brazil, they're Portuguese jokes, right? And they're all about kind of Portuguese being not so bright, not so clever, whatever. So this guy speaks with a Portuguese accent. And then the Afro guy and the Beckham guy walk in, a gong that goes boing, and they kind of go down like this, and then they stand up. And this guy has become a geisha, who now speaks not Portuguese with a Portuguese accent anymore. His accent has changed. And the other two guys have also become Japanese. So that's kind of how the TV commercial works. Oh, Portuguese, but he doesn't speak with a Portuguese accent anymore. He's now become kind of a normal Brazilian person, right? Oh, for those of you who haven't gone to Brazil, this isn't how normal Brazilian people dress. Like, if you're going there for the World Cup, you're not going to see people walking around like this. It's not like that at all. But what's clear in this, again, is how you have this really intense play between different kinds of national identity ideas, right? So as you go through, right, as we look through these images back and forth, it's never quite clear who exactly is part of the nation, but it's always the Brazilian nation is very strong. And I think that's one of the things that, especially for a Japanese studies audience, I think is very important to understand. I go to Japan a lot to do research, and one of the things I'm always interested in is the kind of language of people, of scholars in Japan who are studying Brazil, and who kind of start from the assumption that in Brazil there are Japanese people, as opposed to starting from the assumption that in Brazil there are Brazilian people who may or may not be of Japanese descent, right? And this is a really different way to look at it, because if you think that in Brazil there are lots of Japanese people, the kind of scholarly conclusion is there's a big problem, because it turns out these Japanese people are really bad Japanese. They don't speak Japanese, they don't eat Japanese food, they don't marry people of Japanese descent. If, on the other hand, you think of them as Brazilian people, they seem to be pretty normative. They're Portuguese monolinguals, they eat feijoada, and they marry whoever they want to marry, right? So this is a really important scholarly idea for us maybe to talk about during the debate a little bit, right? How do we do work in diasporas, and what are the assumptions that we make to move forward in these things? The regularity of conscious and unconscious images that we see here is not just about Brazil as here and Japan as over there. Rather, the huge numbers of Japanese Brazilians means that Brazilians are constantly having their notions reinforced and challenged by real people who the majority often feels to have a special bond with Japan. In other words, one of the challenges for Nikkei, so moving now from images of Nikkei to Nikkei themselves, is that part of their kind of day-to-day identity negotiation has to do with the assumption by others that they are somehow Japanese, and their self-assumption that they have nothing to do with Japan. Now, this is fairly common when we talk about ethnicity in the Americas, right? There are all sorts of assumptions people make about members of ethnic groups that are highly essentialized, right? You're Jewish, you must love Israel, right? You're French, you must love snails. I don't know. Whatever the assumptions are, right? But in fact, what you're talking about are Americans or Mexicans or Peruvians or whatever it is. And this is very strongly felt in Brazil because you don't really have constructions of hyphenated ethnicity in the public sphere. In the United States, we've kind of found one way of working around it, right? You don't go to somebody and say, you're Japanese or you're Mexican. You say, you're Japanese American, you're Chicano, right? We have all of these kind of constructions that place the United States clearly into the equation. But in Brazil, you don't really have such a thing. I'll give you one example from my fieldwork in Japan. So for many years, I did fieldwork in a town in Japan called Oizumi. It's in Gunma. And it's a town that prior to World War II, it was a factory town producing fighter airplanes. And after World War II, it kind of got reconfigured as a factory town, and it produces cars, air conditioners, and bento boxes, right? These kind of lunch foods that get sold around Japan. And it's a town in which, I don't know if any of you have ever lived like in a factory town, but it's not that much fun, right? In other words, all you do is work and then leave work, go to sleep, and work some more. And so it's a town that has been highly depopulated of people, let's say, between anybody over 18, right? So when you go there, the Japanese people you meet in this town tend to be older or younger. Everybody else has kind of fled. So this city was one of the cities that brought in lots of foreign workers of Japanese descent, right? The dekasegi. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. And they have probably today 20% of the population of this town is Brazilian, and another 5 or 6% are Peruvian or Bolivian. There was a time when over 30% of the population of this town was Brazilian. So when I was there, that was what it was like. So anyway, so I'm hanging out in this town doing my thing, and I run across a group of kids playing football, playing soccer. And I start talking to them, and one of the guys is a Brazilian kid. And I say, so what's it, like living here in Oizumi? And in general, when you ask Brazilians what it's like to live in Japan, the response is an incredibly negative one. I hate it here. The Japanese are cold, they're uptight, they're obsessed with organizing their garbage. They're obsessed with, these are things that in Brazil and Japan, they're really different cultural styles. They're obsessed with silence in home spaces, right? So there's a lot of conflict between Brazilians and Japanese over parties at home, as opposed to partying in a bar or restaurant, which Brazilians can't generally afford. So I'm expecting this kid to say these kinds of things. But he says, Japan is fantastic. I said, fantastic? What do you mean? He says, in Brazil, when I go to play soccer, it always stinks. I go, and they choose up the teams, and I'm always the last person chosen, and they say, okay, the Jap will play with me, right? We'll take the Jap. And it doesn't matter how many goals I score. The next game, it's still the same thing. There's this assumption that because I look of Japanese descent, I can't play soccer. He says, but here in Japan, it's fantastic. I walk onto the field and everybody screams, Brazilian, play with me, right? And I think that's like a kind of perfect little story about these national identity ideas, right? Where we see here, what this kid is kind of saying is, in Brazil, he's a Brazilian, but in Brazil, he can't quite be fully Brazilian. But in Japan, there he gets to be fully Brazilian, right? And he loves it because he's having his Brazilian national identity experience that he can't have in his own country. Something like that. Okay. Brazilians of Japanese descent are, I think, very engaging objects of study for a number of reasons. First, their Japaneseness often links them in the minds of other Brazilians with Japan. This is in contrast, as I said, with Brazil's mother country of Portugal, which is often linked in Brazil to kind of decadence and degradation. Japanese Brazilian images of Japan are constantly at play in Brazil in all sorts of ways. And an example is this one, which is, I love this. So this is from the Yamaha motorcycle company. This is obviously a photograph or an advertisement from a men's magazine from the 1970s. But what I was there were many things I was interested in. But for the sake of our discussion today, what I was particularly interested in was this. So what this says in Portuguese is kind of have her at your feet, or she'll be at your feet, right? And so the idea is if you have a hot motorcycle, right, the babe will kind of fall over for you, right? You all know this because you're advertising in the United States, right? It works like that. So this is what that says. Then what it says here is more or less the same thing in Japanese. And if we could see this, we would discover that most of the distributors of this Yamaha product are of Japanese descent, right? So my question really was, when I started showing this, was there any indication that Japanese Brazilians were particularly large consumers of Yamaha motorcycles? And it turned out I was able to find out the answer, and the answer is no, right? Japanese Brazilians have no particular interest in Yamaha motorcycles. It turns out that the interest were rich, young members of the Brazilian elite who had this interest. So then the second question was, how many of the consumers of this product could read this Japanese? And the answer was basically none. So then the question is, why do you put it there, right? Why does an advertising agency stick this kind of language there? And there, again, we have this wonderful indication of how it works. Because you don't have to know what this says as a member of Brazilian society to know it's likely Japanese. Frankly, you could have put it up here in Chinese and Korean, and people would have just thought it was Japanese anyway, right? And by doing that, you transform Yamaha from a strictly foreign product into this kind of mixed product. You get this assumption that somehow it's a Japanese product, but Brazilian as well. And obviously that's part of the image play up here, right? You have the technology plus the sexuality, right? That's what I think is going on here. With the kind of images that we have of Japaneseness and Nikkei-ness in Brazil, we also have a very interesting redefinition of racial categories. Many Japanese Brazilians over time move into what we might call a white category. In fact, in the 1930s, there was a vote in the Brazilian Congress that was, this is their language, not mine, who is whiter, Portuguese or Japanese, right? So this is the debate. Who is whiter? And the reason they're having this debate is because the whiter group gets subsidies for immigration. Okay, so again, it's the 1930s. These kinds of things happen also in the United States, as I'm sure you know, in this period. So this debate happens. Japanese overwhelmingly are voted by the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies whiter than Portuguese, and thus are encouraged for immigration. So this is a very interesting idea for us as well, right? How people of Japanese descent get reconfigured in Brazil as white, or sometimes even the whitest of all. Now, this idea of Japanese as white was also encouraged in the 30s and 40s, believe it or not, by the Japanese government, right? There was a sense that Japan was the whites of Asia, right? But in the Brazilian context, one of the things the Japanese government was doing in Brazil was it was publishing kind of propaganda material of whiteness, I guess I would call it that. So one of the things they would do is they would publish books that were called marriage and family books. And so what these books were books filled with photographs of Japanese immigrants, who they married, and what their children looked like. All right, does that make sense? And these books all were the same. A Japanese immigrant male married to the most kind of classically blonde, white, quote, Brazilian you could imagine, and their happy little family, all of whom were kind of blonde and looking like that. Now, I don't know if any of these books are, in other words, I don't know if any of these families are real, right? In other words, all we can say is that the Japanese government is producing them as propaganda, which could lead us to wonder whether, you could find these actual families. But you see there a very interesting kind of collusion, right, between the Japanese government promoting its immigrants as white and a Brazilian society very, very obsessed with whiteness, right, and looking to fit other kinds of people in. Do I have 10 more minutes? Or should I? 10 more minutes. Okay. All right. All right. I want to tell you one other small story, and then I'll finish up, because I think it's interesting and shows how this works in another kind of ways. Over the course of the 20th century, Japanese Brazilians, in aggregate, had higher levels of education, income, etc., than Brazilians overall. In this regard, Japanese Brazilians are like many, many other immigrant groups in Brazil. We would find this same kind of thing if we looked at Jewish Brazilians, Arab Brazilians, etc. This, again, in the United States shouldn't surprise us, where we see, in general, right, immigrants tend to have higher than average, in aggregate, right, in family terms, levels of education, income, etc. Now, in a place like Brazil, which is highly unequal, the divergences are incredibly amplified. So, for example, in terms of education, where only a small percentage of the population gets university educations, having access to universities really propels you forward. What this meant in the 1950s and 60s and 70s was that the most elite universities in Brazil were filled with Brazilians of different ethnic descents. Japanese Brazilians, Arab Brazilians, Jewish Brazilians, etc. In percentages kind of indescribably higher than their percentages in the overall population. And what that also meant in the 1960s was that Japanese Brazilians and other ethnic Brazilians became engaged in political activity, either for or in favor of the dictatorship that took over in Brazil in 1964. There was a military dictatorship for over 20 years, starting in 1964, in ways, let's say, higher than the population in general, right? So do you understand the logic, right? So students are politicized, right? There's a dictatorship. So students, Brazilians of ethnic descent, kind of are part of all that politicization. And one of the things that emerged out of this was the very significant presence of Japanese Brazilians in leftist activity against the dictatorship and in government activity as part of the dictatorship. So, for example, the Minister of Economic Affairs of Brazil at the time created what he announced this openly. He said, "I'm creating my Japanese team to run the economy." By Japanese team, he meant Brazilians of Japanese descent. And he chose a group. We have his notes. He actually looked and he kind of said, "Oh, no, Jewish? No, we'll get rid of him. Portuguese name? Nope. We're going to just take Japanese Brazilians," right? So that's part of the regime. But you also had a large number of Japanese Brazilians who were engaged in anti-government activity. And I'll just tell you quickly about one of them because it's a kind of an incredible story. So one of them is this guy, Shizuo Ozawa. Shizuo Ozawa is Brazilian. He was born in Brazil. He is today at least is a Portuguese monolingual. And he was the first person in his family to go to college. He grew up in a farming community, not particularly well off, but he was a good student and was kind of sent off into the university. At the university, he, like many university students, started reading all sorts of new texts and whatever, and became very influenced by Marxist ideas of social equality. And at the same time, suffered constantly from being told he was Japanese. And so he joined a guerrilla movement in order both to satisfy his kind of social ideological desires, but also to show how Brazilian he was, right? In other words, when you talk to him about it, he talks about his need, right, to use guerrilla activity to show his true Brazilianness, right? Because what makes you a better Brazilian than somebody who's willing to take up a machine gun and risk your life fighting for the Brazilian people, right? So that's his idea. Now, the reason I became interested in him is because his nom de guerre, or his kind of code name, was Mario Japa, which we could translate in English as something like Mario the Jap. And when I met him and did oral histories with him, I went to ask him about this name. I mean, it's a fantastic name, right? It's incredible. And his story, I think, tells us very much about this point I'm trying to get at of the give and take between, let's say, the nation of Brazil as Brazil and the nation of Brazil as Japan. So I go to meet him, and I met him, now he doesn't look like this, right? He's like my grandfather or something like that, right? So I go to meet him, and I say, what's up with this name, Mario the Jap? And he says, his first line is, I've been waiting 20 years for somebody to ask me this question, right? Which is very interesting. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, nobody even in Brazil even questions Mario the Jap. I'm obviously Mario Japa, right? It's just a way you would talk about it, right? Because it's so common, this kind of language. And so what he tells me is that that his actual code name was Mario. And that he chose the name Mario because in this little farming community he grew up in, there was a homeless guy who lived in this community. And this homeless guy was a Japanese immigrant who didn't make it, right? Who wasn't the success story of the stereotypes. And that when he looked at Mario, this homeless immigrant who didn't make it and fulfill the kind of stereotypes, what he saw was Brazil, right? He saw the Brazil being oppressed, the Brazil of the poor, etc. So he chose this name Mario kind of to remember this Japanese immigrant. It's very curious, right? I mean, his kind of mental gymnastics as he's going through it. So in other words, he reinterprets a Japanese immigrant as a kind of Brazilian for the ages. So I said, okay, fair enough. Where does the Japa come from? He says, no. My group, this is a guerrilla group, says they forced me to take this name. They started calling me Mario Japa. So he goes to them and he says, listen, you got to stop calling me Mario Japa, because if one of you gets caught by the cops and they're torturing you, and they say, tell me the names of the other people, and you say Mario Japa, they're all going to know that there's a guy of Japanese descent. They don't stop. So he then calls a meeting of the group, and this is a group where they would have meetings and do these kind of votes on things. One of the things this group was famous for was voting on whether drinking Coca-Cola was kind of an imperialist act, right? So they had like a vote on whether to drink Coca-Cola or not. So he goes to them and he says, you know what? You got to stop calling me Mario Japa. I want to change my name, my code name, my secret name to Fernando. and they have a vote, and he loses, right? So again, this is a really intense idea of how the outsiders, if you will, the non-Japanese Brazilians, are unable to imagine this guy as anything other than a Jap, while at the same time he himself, right, is configuring Japaneseness in an entirely different way. Okay, to conclude. I just want to show you a couple of quick images to show the extent of Japaneseness in modern day Brazil. This is one of my favorites. So Japaneseness has become so common that it even gets incorporated into ritual activity in other ethnic groups. What this is an advertisement for an Orthodox religious ritual event that involves lighting candles. That's all you need to know for the sake of it. And as you can see, the way, and the whole idea of the ritual event is to get people who aren't ritually active to go do this thing, right? So it's a kind of like, what's that called? You know, promoting a religion to members of the religion who aren't practicing, right? Something like that. And so how do you do it? You reconfigure the candles that have to be lighted as part of the ritual into these kind of tekamakis, right? And I have an entire kind of image base of this. Another thing that this particular group does is, in order to attract people, is they have sushi parties, right? And so that's how you attract people in to the ritual event. Okay, with that to conclude, what I guess wanna say is that I hope that in talking about this with you today, you've gotten a sense of how we might think of Japaneseness as a different kind of category than Japanness, and how important it is when we work in the histories of people, of diasporic peoples, if you will, to not start from any kind of assumption that the home country is the kind of baseline of properness, right? So that in order to understand the Japanese diaspora, you have to start from some kind of essential idea of Japan and then test against it. If you want to understand the Lebanese diaspora, you start from some kind of essential idea of Lebanon and test against it. If you want to understand the African diaspora, you start from some kind of essentialized idea of, I don't know, modern Nigeria or modern Kenya and test against it. Rather, what I want to argue, which may seem contradictory for somebody who's interested in diaspora, is that critical to the diaspora is not only the so-called sending country, but also the receiving country. And that I hope what I've shown you today is that when we think about Japanese Brazilians, the country that has the greatest national identity resonance for Japanese Brazilians is Brazil, not Japan. And that you might think about that, we all might think about that as we test against all sorts of other kinds of diasporic ideas. So with that, I'll conclude and thank you for your attention.